The morning Sarah Whitfield left Millbrook, the town bells didn't ring. They never did for women like her, barren women, failed women, women whose bodies had betrayed the sacred promise of motherhood. She stood on the wooden platform of the train station, her worn leather valise at her feet, watching the dust motes dance in the early September light. Behind her, she could hear the whispers starting already, rustling through the gathered crowd like wind through dead cornstalks. Poor thing. Mrs. Henderson murmured to her companion, not bothering to lower her voice enough. Married 3 years to poor Matthew, God rest his soul, and not a single quickening. Now look at her, being sent off like damaged goods. Sarah's gloved fingers tightened on the handle of her carpet bag, but she kept her chin lifted, her gray eyes fixed on the horizon where the railroad tracks disappeared into the shimmering heat. She'd learned long ago that dignity was sometimes all a woman had left to cling to, and she'd be damned if she'd let them see her break now. Her late husband's brother, Thomas, shifted nervously beside her, his Sunday hat turning in circles between his thick fingers. "Now, Sarah," he began, his voice carrying that false heartiness men adopted when they were about to do something shameful. "You understand this is for the best. Eleanor needs the house for our growing family, and well..." He cleared his throat. "Mr. McLean out in Cedar Ridge is a respectable man. Widowed, yes, but respectable. He needs help with his ranch, and you need, well, you need a situation." A situation. That's what they called it when they shipped a woman off to marry a stranger because she'd become an inconvenience. Sarah had overheard Thomas and Eleanor discussing it 3 nights prior, their voices carrying through the thin walls of what had once been her home. "It's perfect." Eleanor had giggled. "James McLean hasn't had a woman on that godforsaken ranch since his wife died 4 years back. He's desperate enough to take anyone, even her. And when he finds out she can't give him children..." Another giggle. "Well, at least we'll have done our Christian duty by her." The train's whistle pierced the morning air, black smoke beginning to belch from the stack. Around her, the good people of Millbrook pressed forward, eager to witness her exile. Sarah recognized most of them. Mrs. Talbot from the general store, who'd stopped extending credit after Matthew died. Pastor Williams, who'd kindly suggested she might find new purpose elsewhere. The Coulter boys, who'd once thrown stones at her after church, chanting "Barren Sarah, Contrary Mary," until their mother half-heartedly called them off. "I've written ahead to Mr. McLean," Thomas continued, pressing a thin envelope into her hand. "He's expecting you. The marriage can be performed in Cedar Ridge. It's all arranged." Arranged, like she was a piece of furniture to be shipped west, postage paid. The conductor called for boarding. Sarah picked up her valise pathetically light, containing the few dresses Thomas had grudgingly allowed her to take, her mother's Bible, a silver brush that had been a wedding gift, and the photograph of Matthew in its cracked leather frame. Everything else now belonged to Thomas and Eleanor, down to the quilts she'd stitched during those long, hopeful months when she'd still believed her womb might quicken. "Sarah." Eleanor appeared at Thomas's elbow, her belly round with her 4th child, her cheeks flushed with health and false concern. "I've packed you a lunch basket, some cold chicken and bread. It's a long journey to Cedar Ridge, nearly 2 days." Sarah accepted the basket with a nod, not trusting her voice. Eleanor's charity was always loudest when there was an audience to appreciate it. "And Sarah..." Eleanor leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried farther than a shout. "Do try to be honest with Mr. McLean about your condition. It's only fair he knows what he's getting." What he's getting? As if she were a horse with a hidden lameness, a cow that wouldn't give milk. The train stairs were high, built for men's longer legs. Sarah hiked up her gray traveling dress, her second best, as Eleanor had claimed her good black silk for herself, and climbed aboard without looking back. She found a seat in the last car, where the benches were hard and the windows were cracked, where women like her belonged. As the train lurched into motion, Sarah finally allowed herself one glance back at Millbrook. The crowd was already dispersing. Their morning's entertainment concluded. Thomas had his arm around Eleanor, guiding her away from the coal smoke. Neither looked back. Sarah settled her spine against the unforgiving bench and opened the envelope Thomas had given her. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the writing cramped and businesslike. Mrs. Whitfield will arrive on the afternoon train. September 15th, as discussed. She is a widow of good character, clean habits, and appropriate age for marriage. She maintains a neat house and cooks plain food well. She has been informed of the arrangement. T. Whitfield. Not a word about who she was, what she loved, what she dreamed. Not a mention of how she could coax roses to bloom in the poorest soil, or how she'd once nursed half the town through scarlet fever, or how she'd held Matthew's hand through his final, fevered nights. Certainly no mention of the 3 times she'd felt that quickening flutter only to wake in blood and pain, the last one taking her ability to conceive again. She was 31 years old, traveling to marry a man she'd never met, in a place she'd never seen, because a barren woman was worth less than the space she occupied in a house that had once been hers. The train picked up speed, carrying her away from everything she'd known. Outside the cracked window, the familiar buildings of Millbrook gave way to farmland, then forest, then open prairie. Sarah closed her eyes and tried not to think about Cedar Ridge, about James McLean, about what kind of man accepted a mail-order bride from relations eager to be rid of her. Instead, she thought about her mother, dead these 15 years, who'd once told her, "Life breaks us all, Sarah girl, but some of us are strong in the broken places." She'd find out soon enough if she was one of them. The basket Eleanor had packed contained a single piece of chicken, the driest piece. Sarah noted with bitter amusement 2 slices of day-old bread, and an apple with a worm hole. Sarah ate methodically, not from hunger but from habit. A woman needed strength for whatever lay ahead. As the sun climbed higher and the train carried her steadily west, Sarah Whitfield allowed herself no tears. Tears were a luxury she could no longer afford, like dreams of children or hopes of love. She had something else now, something harder and more useful, the determination to survive whatever joke fate and the good people of Millbrook had decided to play on her. Cedar Ridge was 2 days away. 2 days to prepare herself for a new life with a man who needed a housekeeper and had settled for a wife. 2 days to bury the woman she'd been and prepare to become whoever James McLean needed her to be. The train whistle screamed again, lonely as a wolf's howl, carrying her toward a future as uncertain as the wild territories themselves. Sarah straightened her shoulders, smoothed her worn gray dress, and watched the world she'd known disappear mile by mile, replaced by an endless sky and the promise of nothing at all. The stagecoach from Cedar Ridge Station lurched to a stop, and Sarah felt her stomach drop with it. Through the dust-caked window, she could see the ranch, if it could even be called that. A collection of weathered buildings huddled against the endless prairie like they were trying to make themselves small enough to escape notice. The main house leaned slightly to the east, its unpainted boards gray as old bones. "McLean Place," the driver called down, his voice suggesting this was the last stop anybody would want to make. Sarah gathered her valise and climbed down, her legs stiff from 2 days of travel. The September sun beat down mercilessly, and the wind carried the smell of cattle and dried grass. No one came to meet her. The driver tossed down her trunk, a small thing that held her few remaining possessions, and climbed back up without a word. Sarah stood in the dusty yard, watching the stagecoach disappear back toward town, taking with it her last connection to civilization. The silence was absolute. Even the wind had stilled, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then the front door opened, and James McLean stepped out. He was nothing like she'd imagined, where she'd expected a grizzled rancher, weathered and rough. James McLean was simply empty, tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that had seen better days. He stood in his doorway like a man who'd forgotten how to move forward. His eyes, brown as winter earth, took her in without a flicker of interest or welcome. "Mrs. Whitfield." It wasn't a question. His voice was low, hoarse from disuse. "Mr. McLean." Sarah lifted her chin, refusing to shrink under that hollow gaze. They stood there, 20 feet apart, measuring each other like adversaries. A crow called from somewhere beyond the barn, harsh and mocking. Finally, he stepped aside. "You'd best come in." The house was worse inside. Dust coated every surface like a shroud. Dishes moldered in a basin by the dry sink. The air smelled of neglect and old sorrow. Sarah set down her valise and tried not to let her dismay show. She'd cleaned worse, she told herself. During the fever outbreak, she'd scrubbed blood and worse from bedroom floors. "Your room's upstairs," McLean said, already turning away. "First door. I sleep down here." He gestured toward a closed door off the main room. "Kitchen's through there, pumps out back, but it's temperamental. Privy's beyond the chicken coop. What's left of it." He started for the door. "Mr. McLean." Sarah's voice stopped him. "When did you plan for the wedding?" He turned back, and for the first time, something flickered in those dead eyes. Surprise, maybe, or confusion. "Wedding." "Yes." Sarah kept her voice steady. "The marriage. Your arrangement with my brother-in-law." McLean's laugh was bitter as alkali water. "Ma'am, I agreed to take on a housekeeper, someone to cook and clean in exchange for room and board. Thomas Whitfield said you needed a position, and I need help keeping this place from falling down around my ears. That's the only arrangement I made." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She saw it all now. Thomas's eager agreement, Eleanor's smirks, the hasty departure. They hadn't married her off. They'd simply found a way to dispose of her that looked respectable from a distance. "I see." Sarah's voice came from very far away. "And if I refuse?" "Then I'll take you back to town come morning. You can catch the next stage to wherever you're going." He paused at the door. "But if you're thinking of going back to Millbrook, I'd reconsider. Thomas Whitfield made it clear you weren't welcome there anymore." The door closed behind him with a finality that echoed through the empty house. Sarah stood in the middle of that desolate room, her hands shaking. Not from fear. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. But from rage. Pure, clean rage that burned through the numbness of the past days. They'd sent her here not as a bride, but as a servant. A charity case for a broken man who couldn't even be bothered to clean his own dishes. She could leave, take what little money she had and try to make her way to Denver or San Francisco, find work as a seamstress or laundress, die slowly in some tenement, forgotten and alone. Or she could stay. Sarah looked around the filthy room, seeing past the neglect to what it might have been. Good bones, her mother would have said. The windows were large, even if they were clouded with grime. The floors were solid wood under the dirt, and through the kitchen door, she could see what might have once been a garden, now choked with weeds. She walked to the window and used her sleeve to clear a small circle in the dust. Outside, James McLean was heading toward the barn, his shoulders bent like he was carrying the weight of the sky, a man who'd given up, just as everyone had given up on her. Sarah Whitfield made her decision. She climbed the narrow stairs, finding the room he'd indicated. It was small, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and hooks on the wall for clothes. The window looked out over the prairie, endless and unforgiving. She set her valise on the bed and unpacked methodically, her dresses on the hooks, her mother's Bible on the washstand. Matthew's photograph she wrapped carefully and placed in the drawer. Then she rolled up her sleeves and went to war with the house. She started with the kitchen, hauling water from the temperamental pump, heating it on the stove that she first had to clean of grease and ash. The dishes in the basin were beyond saving. She threw them out and made a note to scrub the remaining ones she found in the cupboard. The floor hadn't seen a mop in months, maybe years. As she worked, She heard McLean moving around outside, the sound of an axe on wood, the creak of the barn door. Once, she thought she heard him stop outside the kitchen window, but when she looked, no one was there. By evening, the kitchen was clean. Not perfect. That would take days, but clean enough to cook in. She found supplies in the pantry flour gone weevily, salt pork that had seen better days, dried beans, a few withered potatoes. She made what she could, a simple soup, biscuits from the flour she could salvage. When McLean came in at dusk, he stopped in the doorway, staring at the clean kitchen like he'd never seen it before. "Supper's ready," Sarah said simply, ladling soup into 2 bowls. They ate in silence. Sitting at opposite ends of the newly scrubbed table, McLean ate mechanically, his eyes fixed on something beyond the walls. Sarah watched him from under her lashes, trying to read this strange, hollow man who was now her employer, not her husband. Never that. "The arrangement," she said finally. "Room and board for housekeeping. Nothing more." He looked up then, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since her arrival. "Nothing more. I've no interest in a wife. Mrs. Whitfield had one. She's buried out beyond the apple trees, along with our son. I've no intention of replacing them." The words were flat, matter of fact, but Sarah heard the warning in them. Don't expect anything. Don't hope for anything. This is a business arrangement between 2 people with nowhere else to go. "I understand," Sarah said, and she did. "I've no interest in being a wife again either, Mr. McLean, but if I'm to stay here, maintain this house, I'll need supplies, proper cleaning materials, fabric for curtains, seeds for a kitchen garden." Something that might have been surprise crossed his face. "You're staying. Do you have a better offer?" The words came out sharper than she'd intended. A ghost of something, not quite a smile, touched his lips. "No, ma'am, I don't suppose I do." He pushed back from the table. "There's credit at Morrison's in town. Get what you need, within reason." He retreated to his room, closing the door firmly behind him. Sarah sat alone at the table, listening to the wind pick up outside, rattling the windows she'd need to seal before winter. Not a marriage, then not even a friendship. Just 2 broken people sharing a broken house, pretending they weren't both running from something. She cleared the dishes, washed them carefully, and set them to dry. Tomorrow she'd attack the main room. The day after, she'd see about the garden. She'd make this place livable, if not for him, then for herself, because she was Sarah Whitfield, and she'd be damned if she'd let them win, not Thomas and Eleanor with their cruel joke, not this empty man with his locked doors and locked heart, not the whispers that had followed her from Millbrook. Outside, a coyote howled, lonely and defiant. Sarah understood the feeling. She climbed the stairs to her small room, said her prayers though she doubted God was listening to barren women in the wilderness, and lay down fully clothed on the narrow bed. This wasn't the life she'd imagined, but then she'd learned long ago that life rarely asked what you imagined before it knocked you down. The trick was getting back up, and Sarah Whitfield had always been good at getting back up. The first frost came early that October, silvering the prairie grass and sending Sarah out at dawn to cover the tender shoots in what she'd stubbornly decided would be a kitchen garden. James McLean found her there, on her knees in the dirt, wrapping old burlap around the few tomato plants she'd coaxed from seeds bought with her own meager savings. "Waste of time," he said, his breath misting in the cold air. "Nothing grows here anymore." Sarah didn't look up, her fingers working steadily despite the cold. "Things grow where they're tended, Mr. McLean." He made a sound that might have been disgust or despair. Rebecca thought that too. Planted apple trees out there. He gestured toward a small grove beyond the barn. "They still bloom every spring. Never bear fruit, though. Just empty promises." It was the most he'd spoken about his wife since that first night. Sarah sat back on her heels, studying him. In the 6 weeks since her arrival, she'd learned his patterns. Up before dawn, working until dark, eating whatever she put in front of him without comment, retreating to his room like an animal to its den. But sometimes, like now, she caught glimpses of the man he might have been before grief hollowed him out. "Empty promises can still be beautiful," she said quietly. His jaw tightened. "Beauty doesn't fill stomachs or pay debts. That garden's going to die come the first real freeze, and you'll have wasted good money on seeds." "My money to waste. Money you earned keeping house for me. Makes it my responsibility." Sarah stood, brushing dirt from her apron. "No, Mr. McLean, you made it very clear the first day. This is a business arrangement. I work, you provide room and board. What I do with my wages is my own concern." They faced each other across the small garden plot, the morning sun casting long shadows. He looked tired, she thought, more tired than a man of 35 should look. The work was hard. Yes, but it was more than that. He wore his grief like a hair shirt, punishing himself with every breath. "Why do you care so much about a garden that's going to fail?" he asked suddenly. Sarah looked down at the struggling plants, thinking of another garden, another life. "Because I've been told I'm going to fail my whole life, doesn't mean I have to listen." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. Then the walls came back up, and he turned away. "Suit yourself. Just don't expect me to help when it all goes to hell." But that evening, she found a pile of old wooden stakes by the garden plot, perfect for building a windbreak. She didn't thank him. He didn't acknowledge it. It was how they communicated, in silence and small gestures, dancing around each other like wary animals. The house had transformed under her hands. Windows gleamed, floors shone, curtains, sewn from fabric that cost more than she should have spent, brought warmth to the bare rooms. She'd even managed to repair the temperamental pump, though it had taken her crawling under the house with a wrench and emerging covered in mud and spiders. McLean had found her that day, sitting on the back steps, muddy and triumphant, water gushing steadily from the pump for the first time in years. "You don't have to do all this," he'd said, something unreadable in his voice. "Yes," she'd replied simply, "I do." Because if she didn't, she'd go mad. The work kept the thoughts at bay, thoughts of what she'd lost, what she'd never have, what the good people of Millbrook were probably saying about her now. Poor barren Sarah. Couldn't even make a proper mail-order bride. At least when her hands were busy. Her mind couldn't wander down those dark paths. November brought the first real storm, howling down from the north like a living thing. Sarah woke to find snow piling against her window and ice forming on the inside of the glass. She dressed quickly, shivering, and made her way downstairs to stoke the fire. McLean was already there, feeding wood into the stove. "Storm's going to last a few days," he said without turning. "Better bring in what you can from that garden of yours." Sarah grabbed her shawl and headed out into the swirling snow. The wind cut through her dress like knives, but she fought her way to the garden. Most of the plants were already dead, frozen despite her best efforts. But there, protected by the windbreak, he'd never acknowledged building. A few hardy plants survived. She gathered what she could, a handful of green tomatoes, some carrots, the herbs she'd managed to protect. When she turned back to the house, McLean was there, snow already coating his shoulders. Without a word, he took the basket from her and guided her back through the blinding white. His hand on her elbow was the first time he'd voluntarily touched her since her arrival. Inside, she stood shivering by the stove while he set down the basket. "Told you it was a waste," he said, but there was no triumph in it. "There's enough for soup," Sarah countered, her teeth chattering. "And the herbs will last if I dry them properly." He shook his head but said nothing more. They spent the day trapped inside by the storm, the wind howling like grief itself. Sarah worked on mending while McLean repaired harness leather. The silence between them was different somehow, less empty, more companionable. That evening, as she served the soup made from her rescued vegetables, He actually commented on it. "It's good," he said, surprise coloring his voice. "Fresh herbs make a difference," Sarah replied, trying not to show how pleased she was. He studied her across the table. "Why didn't you leave that first day, when you found out the truth? Why didn't you just go?" Sarah set down her spoon, considering, where would I go back to people who sent me away like unwanted furniture to some city where I'd die slowly in a factory or tenement? She met his eyes. "At least here, I'm useful. At least here, what I do matters, even if it's just keeping a house clean and trying to grow tomatoes in impossible soil." "Is that enough?" His voice was rough. "Being useful." "Is it enough for you?" she countered. He looked away. "I'm not looking for anything more." "Neither am I." But it was a lie, and they both knew it, because somewhere between the cleaning and the cooking and the small daily battles, something had shifted. Not love. Sarah wouldn't let herself think that word. But something, a recognition. Maybe two people who'd been broken by life, learning to exist in the same space without cutting each other on their sharp edges. The storm raged for 3 days. By the 3rd day, even the main room was cold, and Sarah found herself sitting closer to the stove, her mending in her lap. McLean had given up pretending to work on the harness and sat reading from a book she hadn't known he owned. Poetry. Of all things. "Rebecca loved poetry," he said suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. "Used to read aloud in the evenings. I never had much patience for it, but—" He trailed off. "But you miss it now?" Sarah finished gently. He nodded, his fingers tracing the worn pages. "Miss a lot of things." The wind howled louder, and somewhere in the house, something crashed. McLean was on his feet instantly, heading for the sound. Sarah followed, and they found one of the upstairs windows had blown in, snow already piling on the floor. Together, they fought to board it up, McLean holding the wood while Sarah hammered nails with frozen fingers. When it was done, they stood in the icy room, breathing hard. "Thank you," he said quietly. "It's my job," Sarah replied, but they both knew it was more than that. That night, as the storm finally began to die, Sarah lay in her cold bed thinking about the strange turns life took. She'd been sent here as a cruel joke, unwanted and unwelcome. But somehow, in this broken house with this broken man, she'd found something she hadn't expected. Purpose. Not the purpose she dreamed of, not children and a loving husband and a home filled with laughter, but purpose nonetheless. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to build a life on. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the world transformed by snow. Sarah stood at her window, watching McLean dig paths to the barn and outbuildings. He moved steadily, methodically, carving order from chaos. She went down to start breakfast and found something on the kitchen table, a small potted plant, one of her herbs he must have rescued and brought inside during the storm. No note, no acknowledgement, just a small green thing, alive against all odds. Sarah touched one tender leaf and smiled, the first real smile since leaving Millbrook. Outside, she could hear McLean working, the steady rhythm of his shovel against snow. She put coffee on to brew and started mixing biscuit dough. There was work to do, a house to tend, a life to build from whatever pieces she could salvage. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but as the morning sun streamed through her clean windows, warming the kitchen she'd made her own, Sarah thought it might be enough. December brought the worst blizzard Cedar Ridge had seen in a decade. It started as light snow on a Tuesday afternoon, but by evening, the wind was screaming like a banshee, driving snow horizontal across the prairie. Sarah had just finished banking the fires when the full force of it hit, rattling the windows she'd sealed and sending drafts through cracks she hadn't known existed. McLean came in from the barn, ice coating his beard, his face grim. "Lost sight of the house twice between here and there," he said, stomping snow from his boots. "This is going to be a bad one." They worked together without discussion, bringing in extra wood, checking the windows, filling every available container with water in case the pump froze. As the storm intensified, the temperature inside dropped despite the roaring stove. By nightfall, ice was forming on the inside walls. "We need to close off the upstairs," McLean said. "Concentrate the heat down here." Sarah nodded, already gathering blankets from the upper rooms. Her small bedroom would be like an icebox by morning. They hung blankets over the stairway, creating a barrier, then stood awkwardly in the main room. "You can have my room," he offered stiffly. "I'll sleep out here by the stove." "Don't be foolish," Sarah said. "We'll both freeze that way. We're adults, Mr. McLean. We can share the warmth of the main room without complications." His jaw worked, but he nodded. They arranged makeshift beds on opposite sides of the room, as far apart as the space allowed. Sarah tried not to think about how thin the barrier of propriety was, how the storm was stripping away the careful distances they'd maintained. By midnight, even with the stove blazing, the cold was bone deep. Sarah lay under every blanket she owned, still shivering. She could hear McLean's restless movements across the room. "Can't sleep either," his voice came out of the darkness. "Too cold," she admitted through chattering teeth. A long pause. Then, "Rebecca always said I was like a furnace at night, too warm to sleep next to in summer." Sarah said nothing, understanding the weight of that admission. "This is about survival," he continued, his voice carefully neutral. "Nothing more." "I understand," Sarah whispered. She heard him get up, drag his bedding closer. Not next to hers, but near enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. They lay in the darkness, listening to the storm rage, the careful space between them feeling both vast and insignificant. "Tell me about her," Sarah said suddenly. "Rebecca." She felt him tense. "Why?" "Because it's a long night, and we're both awake, and she was part of what made you who you are. I'd like to know her, even if just through your memories." The silence stretched so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, quietly, "She had red hair, not auburn or strawberry, but true red, like flame. First time I saw her, she was arguing with her father about the price of wheat, giving him hell about trying to cheat local farmers. I knew right then I was going to marry her." Sarah smiled in the darkness. "How old were you?" 22, fresh from the war, trying to make something of this patch of dirt my father left me." She was 18, smart as a whip, and had no business looking twice at a broken-down soldier with more debt than sense. "But she did." "She did." Wonder colored his voice. "Even after all these years. Said she liked my eyes. Said they were honest." The wind howled louder, shaking the house. Sarah pulled her blankets tighter. "How long were you married?" 8 years. Lost her in childbirth. The baby. He lived 3 days. Long enough to name him. Thomas. We called him Tommy." Sarah's heart clenched. She knew that pain, the cruel hope of those first moments before it all went wrong. "I'm sorry." "She made me promise," he continued, his voice rough. "At the end, when we knew, she made me promise to keep living, to not let this place die with her. I've been failing that promise every day since." "You're still here," Sarah pointed out softly. "Still working the land, keeping the house standing. That's not failing." "Isn't it?" Bitterness crept in. "Look at this place. Before you came, I was living like an animal. Probably would have drunk myself to death or frozen some winter night if Thomas Whitfield hadn't sent you here." "He didn't send me here out of kindness." "No, but maybe there are no accidents." Rebecca believed that. Said everything happened for a reason, even the cruel things. Sarah thought about her own losses, the blood and pain and the doctor's final words. "There's too much damage. I'm sorry. Mrs. Whitfield, but there won't be any children." She'd wanted to die then, had prayed for it through those long, dark nights. But here she was, alive despite everything. "I lost 3. she said, the words coming unbidden. 3 babies. The last one. The doctor said it damaged me inside. Said I'd never... She couldn't finish. McLean was quiet for a long moment. I'm sorry, he said finally. That's a hard burden for a woman to carry. Is it easier for a man? She asked. Losing a child? No, he admitted. Just different. We're supposed to be strong, to provide and protect. When you can't even keep your own son alive, he trailed off. They lay in silence, the storm wrapping them in a strange intimacy. 2 people who'd lost everything, sharing their grief in the darkness. Sometimes, Sarah said quietly, I dream about them, the babies I lost. I see them playing in a garden, always just out of reach. And I wake up and for a moment, I forget. I think maybe it was all a nightmare. Maybe I'm still pregnant. Maybe this time. She swallowed hard. The remembering is almost worse than the losing. Yes, McLean said simply. It is. The stove popped and settled. Outside, the wind seemed to be dying down, though snow still pelted the windows. Sarah found her eyes growing heavy despite the cold. Sarah, McLean's voice was hesitant. Thank you for making this place livable again, for not letting me disappear into my grief. It was the first time he'd used her given name. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you for giving me a place to be useful, for not sending me away. Couldn't, he said, and she heard a hint of wry humor. Who else would brave a blizzard to save a handful of tomatoes? She laughed, surprising them both. They were good tomatoes. They were, he agreed. Best soup I've had in years. The wind died down further, and in the relative quiet, Sarah could hear their breathing fall into rhythm. The space between them didn't seem as vast anymore, though they still didn't touch. 2 souls, battered by loss, finding shelter from more than just the storm. James, she said, testing his name. Do you think they know Rebecca and the babies? Do you think they know we're trying? He was quiet so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, I hope so. I hope they know we're still here, still fighting, even when we don't want to. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling warmer than she had in months. Not just from the shared heat in the room, but from something deeper. Understanding. Acceptance. The knowledge that someone else knew what it was to be hollowed out by loss and still wake up each morning. Good night, James, she whispered. Good night, Sarah. The storm passed in the night, leaving behind a world transformed. Sarah woke to sunlight streaming through the windows, painting everything in shades of gold and white. For a moment, she was disoriented. Then she realized James was already up, the stove blazing, coffee brewing. Morning, he said, not quite meeting her eyes. The intimacy of the night seemed fragile in daylight, something that might shatter if examined too closely. Morning, she replied, gathering her blankets. I'll make breakfast. They moved around each other carefully, rebuilding the walls that had crumbled in the darkness. But something had changed. The silence between them was different now, not empty, but full of shared grief and understanding, of recognition. As Sarah cooked, she noticed James pause by the window, looking out at the snow-covered land. Going to check the animals, he said. See what we lost in the storm. Be careful, she said automatically, then flushed at the concern in her voice. He looked at her then, really looked at her. I will, he said softly. After he left, Sarah stood in the kitchen they'd shared through the storm, thinking about walls and distances and the strange comfort of another's pain. She'd come here expecting nothing, finding in James McLean just another burden to bear. Instead, she'd found something else entirely. Not love, she wouldn't let herself think that word, not yet, but connection, understanding, and maybe, just maybe, the first fragile shoots of hope. The pounding on the door came just after midnight on a February night when the wind howled like wolves and sleet rattled against the windows. Sarah jerked awake, heart racing, as the pounding came again, desperate, frantic. James was already up, pulling on his boots, rifle in hand. "Stay back," he ordered. But Sarah was already lighting a lamp, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. "Please," a woman's voice, barely audible over the storm. "Please help us." James yanked open the door, and a figure stumbled in. A young woman, perhaps 20, her dark hair plastered to her head with snow and ice. Her dress was torn, blood-stained, and in her arms. "Dear God," Sarah breathed, rushing forward as the woman swayed. A baby, tiny, wrapped in what looked like petticoats, making small, mewling sounds that tore at Sarah's heart. "Please," the woman gasped, her lips blue with cold. "Take her! Take care of her!" She thrust the bundle into Sarah's arms before James could stop her. The weight of the infant, so light, so precious, made Sarah's knees weak. She looked down at the tiny face, red and scrunched with cold, and felt something crack open inside her chest. "Get her by the fire," James commanded, already supporting the woman who was swaying on her feet. "Both of them!" Sarah moved automatically, cradling the baby close as she hurried to the warmth of the stove. Behind her, she heard James half carrying the woman to a chair. "What's your name?" he asked. "Where did you come from?" "Mary," the woman whispered. "Mary Watson, from back east. Been running 3 days." Sarah unwrapped the baby carefully, checking for signs of frostbite. The infant was a girl, perhaps 2 months old, thin but miraculously unharmed. She'd been protected by her mother's body heat, Sarah realized, even as Mary herself froze. "Why are you running?" James asked, but Mary had slumped forward, unconscious. "James!" Sarah called urgently. "She's burning with fever." They worked together without words, years of frontier living making them efficient in crisis. James carried Mary to his room, the nearest to the stove, while Sarah heated water and gathered clean cloths. The baby fussed weakly, and Sarah found herself humming, an old lullaby her mother had sung. "She's in a bad way," James said quietly, returning from the bedroom. "Pneumonia, by the sound of her breathing, and she's lost a lot of blood." Sarah looked down at the baby in her arms. "From childbirth." "Too old for that. The baby's at least 2 months. No, this is something else." His face was grim. "She said she'd been running. Those wounds. Someone hurt her." The baby began to cry in earnest now, a thin, hungry wail. Sarah felt panic rise in her throat. "We don't have anything to feed her. No milk, no—" "Morrison's got a goat," James said, already reaching for his coat. "I'll go." "In this storm, James, you can't let a baby starve," he said simply. "Keep them both warm. I'll be back." He was gone before she could protest further, swallowed by the howling darkness. Sarah stood in the suddenly empty kitchen, the baby's cries growing more desperate. She did the only thing she could think of, walked and rocked and sang, the way she'd dreamed of doing for her own children. "Hush now, little one," she whispered. "He'll be back. He'll bring food. Just hold on." The baby's weight in her arms was agony and ecstasy combined. Every maternal instinct she'd thought dead roared to life. This child needed her in a way no one had needed her since Matthew died. She checked on Mary every few minutes. The young woman tossed in fever dreams, muttering words Sarah couldn't catch. Once, she gripped Sarah's hand with surprising strength. "Promise me," she gasped. "Promise you'll keep her safe. They can't have her." "Who?" Sarah asked. "Who's after you?" But Mary had slipped back into unconsciousness. An hour passed, 2. The baby had exhausted herself crying and now lay limp in Sarah's arms. Too quiet. Sarah found herself praying for the first time in months. Not for herself. She'd given up on those prayers. But for this tiny life and the man fighting through the storm to save her. Finally, Blessedly. She heard boots on the porch. James burst in, covered in ice but triumphant, a pail of goat's milk in one hand and a nursing bottle in the other. "Mrs. Morrison sent this," he said, holding up the bottle. "Said she figured we'd need it." Sarah could have wept with relief. They warmed the milk carefully, and Sarah coaxed the rubber nipple between the baby's lips. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then the infant latched on, sucking weakly at first, then with growing strength. "There you go," Sarah murmured, tears running down her cheeks. "There's my strong girl." James watched them, something unreadable in his eyes. "You're natural with her." "I always wanted—" Sarah couldn't finish. "I know," he said softly. "I remember." They took turns through the night, caring for the baby and checking on Mary. The young woman's fever climbed higher, her breathing more labored. Near dawn, she woke, lucid for the first time. "My baby," she whispered. Sarah brought the infant to her, helped her see that the child was safe, fed, warm. Mary's eyes filled with tears. "I knew," she said, "knew I'd find someone who'd love her." "Mary," Sarah said urgently, "who's after you, who hurt you?" Mary's face twisted. "My husband, Richard Watson, rich man, powerful man, said no bastard would inherit his name." Sarah's blood ran cold. "The baby, not his," Mary confirmed weakly. "My shame. He called her my sin. He was going to kill her, make it look like an accident. So I ran." She gripped Sarah's hand. "He'll come looking. He won't stop, but he thinks I was heading to California. Told everyone I'd stolen money. Jewels. They'll look there. Not here." Her breathing grew more labored. "Legal papers," she gasped. "In my coat, saying I give her up to whoever saves her. Make it legal. Make her yours." "Mary, no," Sarah protested. "You're going to get better. You're going to—" "Please." Mary's eyes found James. "You're good people. I can tell. Please, give her. Give her what I can't. A life. A chance." The rattle in her chest grew worse. Sarah clutched the baby tighter as Mary's hand went slack in hers. By the time the sun broke over the frozen prairie, Mary Watson was gone. They found the papers she'd spoken of, tucked in an oilskin packet, legal documents, properly witnessed, giving up all claim to the child, granting full custody to whoever cared for her. There was also a birth certificate. The baby's name was Grace Watson, born December 3rd, 1869 in Boston, Massachusetts. "She planned this," James said quietly, reading through the papers. "She knew she might not make it." Sarah looked down at the baby, Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms. "What do we do?" James was quiet for a long moment. "Then we bury her mother with dignity. We keep the child safe, and we let people think what they will." "James," he met her eyes. "You came here as my housekeeper, but if questions get asked, if someone comes looking, it might be better if you were my wife. Legal-like, for the baby's sake." Sarah's heart stopped, then started again, too fast. Are you proposing?" "I'm being practical," he said, but his voice was rough. "That baby needs parents, legal ones, and you need her as much as she needs you. I can see it." "And you?" Sarah asked. "What do you need?" He looked at Grace, and something softened in his face. Maybe a second chance, to get it right this time. Sarah stood slowly, Grace cradled against her chest. She walked to where James stood by the window, watching the sun rise over the snow-covered land. "All right," she said simply. "For Grace." "For Grace," he agreed. But as their eyes met over the baby's head, Sarah wondered if they were both lying. If maybe, just maybe, it was for themselves too. For the chance to be more than broken people in a broken house. For the chance to be a family. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the world clean and new. And in Sarah's arms, Grace stirred and cooed, a tiny promise of hope in a world that had seemed hopeless for so long. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived, it transformed the McLean ranch. Sarah watched from the porch as James worked the fields. Grace balanced on her hip, babbling at the birds. The baby had thrived in their care, growing round-cheeked and bright-eyed, her laughter filling the house that had been silent for so long. They'd married quietly in Cedar Ridge 2 weeks after Mary Watson's death, the minister asking no questions about the baby Sarah held. The story they told was simple enough. Sarah had come west as James's intended, and the baby was theirs. In a frontier town where people minded their own business, it was enough. But now, 3 months later, the whispers had started. Sarah McLean certainly recovered from her barren state quickly. Mrs. Henderson observed at the general store, her voice carrying despite her pretense of discretion. Sarah, selecting fabric for Grace's clothes, kept her face carefully neutral. "Miraculous? Really?" Mrs. Talbot agreed, eyeing Sarah with naked suspicion. Especially considering she was married to poor Matthew for 3 years without a single blessing. Sarah paid for her purchases and left without comment, but her hands shook as she loaded the wagon. James was waiting outside, having overheard everything through the thin walls. "Let them talk," he said quietly, taking Grace so Sarah could climb up. "We know the truth." "Do we?" Sarah asked, surprising herself with the bitterness in her voice. "Sometimes I forget she's not really mine. When she smiles, when she reaches for me, I forget." James was quiet as they drove home, Grace sleeping between them. "Finally, she is yours, ours, in every way that matters." That evening, as Sarah prepared supper, she heard horses approaching. James went to the door, and she heard unfamiliar voices, city voices, cultured and cold. "Mr. McLean, I am Harold Pemberton, attorney at law. This is my associate, Mr. Crane. We're here regarding a missing woman and child." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She clutched Grace tighter, the baby sensing her distress and beginning to fuss. "Don't know anything about missing women," James said evenly. "Just me and my wife here." "Your wife," Pemberton's voice sharpened. "Recently married, I understand, with a young baby." "That's right." "How fortunate. May we come in? I'm sure we can clear this up quickly." Sarah heard James step aside, and 2 men entered, one thin and sharp-featured, the other broad and intimidating. Pemberton's eyes went immediately to Grace. "What a beautiful child," he said smoothly. "How old?" 4 months, Sarah said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Interesting. The child we're looking for would be about that age." He produced a photograph. "This is Mary Watson. She disappeared from Boston in December with her infant daughter. Her husband is most anxious to find them." Sarah looked at the photograph. Mary, but younger, healthier, expensively dressed. "I've never seen her before." "No, how curious. You see, we've traced her west. She was seen in Kansas City, then Denver. The trail goes cold after that, but—" He smiled thinly. "A woman traveling alone with a baby in winter would be memorable. Desperate, perhaps desperate enough to give the child to strangers." "That's quite a story," James said, "but it's got nothing to do with us." "Perhaps not," Pemberton agreed. "Tell me, Mrs. McLean, where did you deliver your baby?" "Here at home," Sarah said. "My husband delivered her." "No midwife, no doctor." "Nearest doctor's a day's ride." James interjected. "Couldn't risk it in winter." Crane spoke for the first time, his voice like gravel. "Convenient. No witnesses." "Are you calling my wife a liar?" James's voice was dangerously quiet. "Not at all," Pemberton said smoothly. We're simply investigating all possibilities. You understand. Mr. Watson is a powerful man. He has resources. He's offering a substantial reward for information. We don't need his money, James said flatly. Everyone needs money. Mr. McLean, your ranch, for instance, behind on taxes. Aren't you, Mr. Watson could be a very generous friend, or... He let the threat hang. Grace began to cry in earnest. Sarah stood, bouncing her gently. If you'll excuse me, I need to feed my daughter. She escaped to the bedroom, hands shaking as she prepared a bottle. Through the thin door, she could hear the men talking. We'll be staying in Cedar Ridge for a few days, Pemberton was saying. I'm sure the good people there will have much to tell us about your sudden family. Mr. McLean. After they left, James found her sitting on the bed, Grace sleeping in her arms, tears streaming down her face. They know, she whispered. They know she's not ours. James sat beside her, his hand covering hers. They suspect that's different. Is it you heard them? They'll ask questions in town. Someone will remember I arrived alone, that we married suddenly, that... Sarah, his voice was firm. Look at me. She met his eyes, seeing determination there, and something else, something that had been growing between them since that night of the blizzard. That baby is ours, he said. Mary gave her to us, legal papers and all. More than that. He touched Grace's downy head gently. She's brought life back to this place. To us, I won't let anyone take her. But if Watson comes himself, then we'll face him together. The next days were torture. Every trip to town brought new stares, new whispers. Pemberton and Crane questioned everyone, their presence like a dark cloud over Cedar Ridge. Sarah kept Grace close, afraid to let her out of sight. The confrontation came on a Sunday after church. Sarah was loading Grace into the wagon when Mrs. Henderson approached, Pemberton at her elbow. Sarah, dear, she said with false sweetness. Mr. Pemberton's been asking about when your baby was born. I was trying to remember. When exactly did you arrive in Cedar Ridge? September, Sarah said shortly. Yes, and you were so thin then, not showing at all. Mrs. Henderson's smile was sharp. Miraculous how quickly you bloomed. My wife's health is our business, James said, appearing at Sarah's side. Of course, Pemberton interjected smoothly. We're simply trying to establish a timeline. You see, if your child was born in December, as you claim, then Mrs. McLean would have been quite far along when she arrived, yet no one seems to remember noticing her condition. A crowd was gathering. The good Christians of Cedar Ridge scenting scandal. Sarah felt their judgment like a physical weight. Perhaps, Mrs. Talbot suggested loudly. Sarah can tell us who attended the birth. Surely someone helped deliver the baby. I did, James said firmly. My wife, my child, my home. How convenient, someone muttered. Grace, sensing the tension, began to wail. Sarah tried to comfort her, but the baby's cries only grew louder. Listen to that, Pemberton said suddenly. Such distinctive cries. Mrs. Watson always said her daughter had a particular way of crying, 3 short wails, then a long one, just like that. It was a lie. Sarah could see it in his calculating eyes, but the crowd was murmuring, doubt spreading like wildfire. Enough. A new voice cut through the noise. Old Doc Morrison pushed through the crowd, his medical bag in hand. I've heard enough gossip for one Sunday. Doctor, Pemberton began. We're simply... I know what you're doing. Morrison interrupted, stirring up trouble, making accusations. Well, I've got something to say about it. He turned to the crowd. I delivered Grace McLean myself. Difficult birth. That's why they didn't send for me until after. Touch and go for a while. But both mother and baby pulled through. Sarah stared at him in shock. Morrison had never been to their ranch. Had never... That's right, Morrison continued, his eyes meeting hers briefly. December 20th, if memory serves. Cold night. Nearly didn't make it through the snow. But, Mrs. Henderson sputtered. Are you calling me a liar? Agnes Henderson. Morrison's voice was steel. Been doctoring in this town for 20 years, and now you question my word. The crowd shifted uneasily. Morrison's word carried weight. Pemberton wasn't finished. Perhaps you could describe the birth. Doctor, for our records. Morrison snorted. I don't discuss my patient's private matters with strangers. Or with anyone else. He looked pointedly at the crowd. Seems some folks have forgotten common decency. One by one, people began to drift away, shamed by the old doctor's words. Pemberton's face was tight with frustration. This isn't over, he said quietly to James. Mister, Watson doesn't give up easily. Neither do I, James replied. As the lawyers retreated, Morrison touched Sarah's arm. Bring the little one by my office tomorrow. Been meaning to check on her progress. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Dr. Morrison, Tomorrow, he said firmly. Then lower. Sometimes the family we choose is more real than the one we're born to. That night, as Sarah tucked Grace into her cradle, she marveled at how fiercely she loved this child who hadn't grown beneath her heart. The townspeople's suspicions, Watson's threats, none of it mattered beside the simple fact of Grace's existence in their lives. James appeared in the doorway, watching them. We might have to leave, he said quietly. If Watson comes himself, if he brings more pressure, then we'll go, Sarah said simply. California, Oregon, anywhere, as long as we're together. He crossed to her, his hand settling on her shoulder. You'd give up everything for her. She is everything, Sarah said. You both are. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. James's hand tightened on her shoulder, and for a moment, she thought he might say something more. Then Grace stirred, making soft baby sounds, and the moment passed. But as they stood together in the lamplight, watching their daughter sleep, Sarah knew they'd already won the only battle that mattered. They were a family, not by blood, perhaps, but by choice, by sacrifice, by love. And that was stronger than any law, any threat, any whispered gossip. Let them all come, Sarah thought fiercely. We'll be ready. The courthouse in Cedar Ridge had never seen such a crowd. Every bench was packed, people standing along the walls, spilling out into the hallway. Sarah sat at the defendant's table, Grace in her arms, trying to keep her hands from shaking. James sat beside her, his presence solid and reassuring, while their lawyer, young Sam Garrett, the only one who'd take their case, shuffled papers nervously. Across the aisle, Richard Watson sat with Pemberton and 2 additional lawyers from Boston. Watson was everything Sarah had imagined, cold, calculating, with a kind of handsomeness that masked cruelty. He hadn't looked at Grace once, referring to her only as the child or my property. Judge Theodore Banks, brought in from the county seat for this special hearing, called for order. This court will determine the custody of the minor child currently in the care of James and Sarah McLean. Mr. Pemberton, you may begin. Pemberton rose smoothly. Your Honor, the facts are simple. My client's wife, Mary Watson, suffering from hysteria following childbirth, absconded with their daughter in December. She stole money and jewelry from Mr. Watson and fled west. We have testimony placing her in Kansas City and Denver. The child in Mrs. McLean's arms matches the age and description of Grace Watson. We demand she be returned to her rightful father immediately. Do you have proof this is the same child? Judge Banks asked. The timing is undeniable. Your Honor, the McLeans claim their child was born in December, yet Mrs. McLean arrived in Cedar Ridge in September showing no signs of pregnancy. They married hastily in February, suddenly in possession of a 2-month-old infant. The coincidence strains credulity. Pemberton called his first witness, Mrs. Henderson, eager to share her observations about Sarah's suspicious lack of maternal symptoms. Then Mrs. Talbot, who testified about Sarah's barren state in Millbrook. Each word was a dagger, but Sarah kept her eyes on Grace, drawing strength from the baby's peaceful sleep. Furthermore, Pemberton continued, we have evidence that Mary Watson was seen near Cedar Ridge in early February, just days before the McLean's sudden marriage. He produced affidavits from travelers, from station agents. The case he built was circumstantial but damning. Sarah felt the walls closing in. Then Pemberton played his cruelest card. Your Honor, even if we accept the McLean's version of events, what kind of life can they offer a child they are barely surviving on a failing ranch? Mr. McLean is known to be a recluse, devastated by the loss of his first family, and Mrs. McLean. He paused dramatically. Mrs. McLean was cast out by her own family for her inability to bear children. What cruel irony, to give an infant to a woman incapable of providing siblings, of understanding true motherhood. Sarah's cheeks burned, but she kept her head high. Beside her, she felt James tense with anger. Mr. Watson, on the other hand, Pemberton gestured to his client, can provide every advantage: education, society, a grand home in Boston, the child's true heritage. Sam Garrett rose shakily for the defense. He was young, earnest, but clearly outmatched. Your Honor, my clients have cared for Grace since February. They've provided love, stability. Illegally, Pemberton interrupted. Receiving stolen property, one might say. That's enough, Judge Banks said. Mr. Garrett, do you have witnesses? Sam called Dr. Morrison, who testified about treating Grace, about the McLean's devotion. Then Pastor Williams, not from Cedar Ridge, but from a neighboring town, who spoke about performing their marriage and seeing their love for the child. But it wasn't enough. Sarah could see it in the judge's eyes, hear it in the crowd's murmurs. The law was the law, and if Grace was truly Mary Watson's child— Your Honor, Sam said desperately, we'd like to call Sarah McLean to testify. Sarah handed Grace to James and took the stand. Her voice was steady as she recounted finding Mary at their door, the young woman's desperate flight, her dying wish. She gave Grace to us, Sarah said, meeting the judge's eyes. With legal papers, giving up all rights. She knew her husband would harm the child. Lies. Watson spoke for the first time, his voice cutting. My wife was delusional. Any papers were signed under duress. Did you keep these supposed papers? The judge asked. Sarah's heart sank. They were lost in a fire. The suspicious fire that had destroyed their barn just days after Pemberton's first visit, though they couldn't prove arson. How convenient, Pemberton said smoothly. Your Honor. Sam stood again. We have one more witness, James McLean. James took the stand, his weather-worn face grave. He spoke simply, honestly, about the night Mary arrived, about burying her with dignity, about the choice to raise Grace as their own. Mr. McLean. Pemberton began his cross-examination. You lost a child once before, didn't you? James's jaw tightened. Yes. A son, who lived only 3 days. Your wife died in childbirth. Yes. That must have been devastating. Tell me, when this strange woman appeared with a baby, didn't part of you see it as replacement? A chance to pretend the past never happened? No, James said firmly. Grace isn't a replacement for anyone. She's herself. And she's our daughter now. Because a dying woman said so, because you decided to keep her, like a stray puppy. Because she needed us. James's voice rose. Because her mother died protecting her from a man who saw her as property, not a person, because sometimes what's legal and what's right aren't the same thing. Your Honor, Pemberton protested. The witness is making speeches. I'll allow it. Judge Banks said, Continue, Mr. McLean. James looked directly at Watson. I've buried a wife and child. I know what loss is, but I also know what love is. And that little girl has been loved every moment she's been with us. Can you say the same? Mr. Watson, you haven't looked at her once, haven't asked if she's healthy, if she's happy. She's not a daughter to you, she's a possession, a thing to be owned. She bears my name, Watson said coldly. That's all that matters. Is it? James turned to the judge. Your Honor, there's something else, something we didn't want to say, to speak ill of the dead. But Mary Watson told us the truth before she died. Grace isn't Richard Watson's child. The courtroom erupted. Watson shot to his feet, face purple with rage. How dare you? She told us, James continued calmly. That's why she ran. That's why he wants the child dead, because she's proof of his wife's infidelity. Lies, Watson roared. Slander. Judge Banks gavelled for order. Mr. Watson, control yourself. Mr. McLean, this is a serious accusation. Mary told us with her dying breath. James said, Ask him, Your Honor. Ask him why a wealthy man would chase across the country for a baby he calls property. Ask him what he plans to do with Grace if he gets her. Watson's lawyers were trying to calm him, but his mask had slipped. That child is a bastard, he snarled. But she bears my name, and I'll decide her fate. Ship her to relatives. Put her in an orphanage. Whatever it takes to bury this scandal. But I will not have my wife's shame raised by frontier trash. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Pemberton looked shaken. Sarah found her voice. Your Honor, may I speak? Judge Banks nodded. She stood, Grace awake now and reaching for her. Sarah took her daughter, and faced the court. I was told my whole life that I was broken, she said. That a woman who couldn't bear children was worthless. When my husband died, his family sent me away like I was nothing. I came here expecting nothing. But this child, this precious girl, she gave me purpose again. Not because she replaced the babies I lost, but because she needed me. And I needed her. We chose each other. All three of us. We became a family. Maybe the law says blood matters more than love. Maybe it says a rich man's claim matters more than a dying woman's wish. But I'm asking you to look at Grace. Really look at her. And ask yourself, where will she be loved? Where will she be safe? Where will she have the chance to grow up knowing she's wanted? Not for what she represents, but for who she is. Grace babbled happily, reaching for James, who came to stand beside them. The three of them faced the judge together. Judge Banks was quiet for a long moment. Then, Mr. Watson, approach the bench. Watson stalked forward, his composure regained but brittle. You say this child isn't yours by blood. My wife's indiscretion is not... Answer the question. Watson's jaw worked. No, she's not mine by blood, but legally. Mr. Pemberton. The judge continued. Do you have any proof that Mary Watson didn't voluntarily give up custody? Any witnesses to coercion? No, Your Honor, but... Mr. Watson, what are your intentions for the child if custody is granted? As I said, relatives or an appropriate institution. You intend to abandon her. I intend to handle a family matter discreetly. Judge Banks looked at Grace, who was now playing with Sarah's collar, then at the McLeans, standing together like a shield around the child. This court, he said slowly, must consider the best interests of the child. While Mr. Watson may have legal claims, he has also admitted the child is not his by blood and that he has no intention of raising her. He has shown no paternal interest, only a desire to eliminate an embarrassment. The McLeans, while perhaps irregular in their acquisition of custody, have demonstrated genuine parental love and commitment. They have provided a stable home and nurturing care. Furthermore, Mr. Watson's own testimony suggests that pursuing this matter further would only bring scandal upon his family name, scandal that would follow this innocent child throughout her life if she were returned to Boston society. Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that Grace McLean shall remain in the custody of James and Sarah McLean, her adoptive parents. Mr. Watson's petition is denied. The courtroom exploded again. Cheers from some, outrage from Watson's contingent. Sarah clutched Grace, tears streaming down her face, while James's arm came around them both. "This isn't over," Watson hissed as he passed. "I have influence, connections, and I have a telegraph to send to the Boston papers," Sam Garrett said quietly, having found his courage at last. "About a prominent businessman who chased his wife to her death and tried to destroy an innocent child. How do you think your influence will fare against that scandal?" Watson paled, then turned on his heel and left, Pemberton scrambling after him. In the chaos that followed, Sarah found Dr. Morrison. "Thank you," she said, "for lying about delivering her, for believing in us." The old doctor smiled. "Who says I lied? I delivered Grace McLean to her parents that day in my office. Born into your hearts, if not from your body. That's as real a birth as any I've attended." As they left the courthouse, Grace secure in Sarah's arms and James's hand steady on her back, Sarah looked up at the wide western sky. They'd won more than a legal battle today. They'd claimed their right to be a family, to choose love over law, hope over history. "Let's go home," James said quietly. "Home? Yes," Sarah thought, pressing a kiss to Grace's head. That's exactly what they'd won. The morning of their second wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of pristine blue sky that made the prairie look endless. Sarah stood before the mirror in her bedroom, their bedroom now, though they'd only recently begun sharing it, adjusting the collar of her new dress. Not white, for she was no blushing bride, but a soft blue that brought out the gray in her eyes. "Mama," Grace called from her cradle, now speaking her first words at nearly 8 months old. The child had thrived in the months since the trial, growing rosy and strong, her laughter filling every corner of the house. "Yes, my darling," Sarah cooed, lifting her daughter. "Today's a special day. Today we become a real family in everyone's eyes." Though in her heart, they'd been a real family since that wild February night when Mary Watson placed Grace in her arms. A knock at the door made her turn. "Come in." James entered, then stopped, his breath catching. "You look—" he cleared his throat. "You look beautiful. Sarah." She felt heat rise in her cheeks like a young girl. "It's just a dress from Morrison's." "It's not the dress." He crossed to them, his hand gentle on Grace's head, his eyes on Sarah's. "It's you. It's always been you." In the weeks since the trial, something had shifted between them. The careful walls they'd maintained had crumbled, replaced by tender glances, lingering touches, and the kind of deep contentment Sarah had never thought to find again. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. "I've been ready since that night in the blizzard," she admitted. "When you told me about Rebecca and Tommy, when you saw me not as the barren woman everyone else saw, but as just Sarah." "Never just Sarah," he corrected, his voice rough with emotion. "Sarah, who fought for our daughter. Sarah, who brought life back to this dead house. Sarah, who saved me from disappearing into my grief." "We saved each other," she whispered. Grace babbled happily, patting both their faces with chubby hands, and they laughed, the moment lightening. "Come on," James said, offering his arm. "Half the county's waiting to see us properly married. Can't disappoint them." The church was indeed packed. Word of the trial had spread, turning them into unlikely heroes, the couple who'd fought a rich man for love of a child. Sarah saw faces she recognized Dr. Morrison in the front row, beaming like a proud grandfather. Sam Garrett, no longer the nervous young lawyer, but confident after his courtroom victory. Even Mrs. Henderson, who'd had the grace to apologize for her gossip. Pastor William stood at the altar, his own wife holding grace during the ceremony, as Sarah and James faced each other, speaking vows they'd already made in their hearts. She thought about the strange paths life took. "Do you, James McLean, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," James said, his eyes never leaving hers, today and every day after. "Do you, Sarah Whitfield McLean, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Sarah breathed, "with all my heart." "Then, by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife, what God has joined together. Let no man put asunder." When James kissed her, the church erupted in cheers. Grace, startled by the noise, began to cry, and they broke apart, laughing, reaching for their daughter. "Seems she wants to be included." Pastor Williams chuckled. "And why not? This is her day too." The reception was held at the ranch. Tables set up in the yard Sarah had coaxed back to life. Her garden was thriving now, vegetables and flowers growing in defiance of everyone who'd said nothing would grow there. The apple trees Rebecca had planted were heavy with blossoms. And this year, James said, they might actually bear fruit. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Sarah found herself on the porch with Mrs. Morrison, watching James dance with Grace in his arms, the baby shrieking with delight. "You've done a miracle here," the older woman said. "This place, that man, that child, all transformed." "Not me alone," Sarah protested. "James would still be a ghost haunting his own life if you hadn't come, and you'd still be believing the lies they told you about your worth." Mrs. Morrison patted her hand. "Sometimes the Lord works in mysterious ways, sends us what we need, not what we think we want." Thomas and Eleanor had sent a letter, not of congratulations, but asking for money, claiming Sarah owed them for her rescue. James had burned it in the stove, declaring they were dead to this family. Sarah had felt only relief. That chapter of her life was closed forever. "Sarah," James called, "come dance with us." She joined them, the three of them swaying together as the fiddle player struck up a slow waltz. Grace nestled between them, safe and loved. "No regrets?" James asked quietly. "How could I regret the path that brought me here?" Sarah replied. "That brought me both of you." As if in agreement, Grace babbled, "Mama, Papa," her new favorite words. They'd taught her, of course, but she said them with such joy, such certainty, that it never failed to move them. The guests began to drift away as darkness fell, each offering congratulations and blessings. Soon it was just the three of them, standing under the vast canopy of stars. "I have something for you," James said, producing a small wrapped package. Sarah opened it carefully, gasping at what lay inside, a delicate gold locket on a chain. "Open it," he urged. Inside was a tiny photograph of Grace on one side, and on the other, an inscription, "Family is where love lives." "James," she breathed, tears pricking her eyes. "I wanted you to have something," he said, fastening it around her neck. "Something that says what you mean to us, to me." "I love you," she said, the words she'd been afraid to speak finally breaking free. "I think I have since that night you brought goat's milk through a blizzard for our daughter." "Our daughter," he repeated, wonder in his voice. "I love you too, Sarah. Both of you. My second chance at everything." They stood together on the porch of the house that was no longer broken, no longer empty. Light spilled from the windows Sarah had cleaned, warming the flowers she'd planted, illuminating the life they'd built from loss and determination. "You know what I was thinking earlier," Sarah said, settling Grace on her hip. "About what Eleanor said when they sent me away, that it was perfect. You were desperate enough to take anyone, even me." James's jaw tightened. "Eleanor's a fool." No, Sarah said softly. She was right, but not in the way she meant. It was perfect. We were both broken, both lost. We needed each other, and we needed grace. Needed to be needed, James agreed. To have something to fight for again. Grace yawned hugely, and they laughed, heading inside to put her to bed. As Sarah tucked the quilt around their daughter, the quilt she'd made from scraps of their old lives, sewn together into something new and beautiful. She thought about the journey that had brought them here. Sent west as a barren woman, a cruel joke by those who should have loved her. Arriving at a dead house with a dead man's grief, finding instead life, love, and the family she'd dreamed of in a form she'd never imagined. "What are you thinking?" James asked, his arms coming around her from behind. "That sometimes," Sarah said, leaning back against his solid warmth, "the cruelest jokes become the greatest blessings. They sent me here to disappear. Instead, I found everything." "We found everything," he corrected, pressing a kiss to her temple. Outside, a coyote called across the prairie, no longer lonely, but simply wild and free. Inside, a family prepared for their first night together under the same roof, officially united, officially whole. The woman who'd been told she was barren had become a mother. The man who'd thought he'd never love again had opened his heart, and the child who'd been born in scandal and sorrow had found a home where she was treasured beyond measure. In the morning, there would be chores and challenges, the daily work of living, but tonight, in the lamplit warmth of their home, there was only gratitude for the unexpected ways love could grow, even in the harshest ground. Sarah touched the locket at her throat, feeling the weight of it like a promise. Family is where love lives, and love, she'd learned, could bloom anywhere, even in a place everyone said was too broken for growing things. As she settled into bed beside her husband, their daughter safe in her cradle nearby, Sarah offered up a prayer of thanks for cruel jokes that became miracles, for broken people who became whole together, and for the wild, wide west that had taught them all how to begin again. Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey through the American frontier. I hope Sarah and James's story touched your heart as much as it touched mine while telling it. Where are you listening to this story from? I'd love to hear from listeners around the world. Please subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about this tale of love, loss, and finding family in the most unexpected places. Did this story remind you of your own family's journey? Let me know in the comments below.